Good morning, everybody. Let me try to talk. I don't want to go too long. But today is Friday, and in a nutshell, what I would like to do is give an expanded version of what's happening in our world today. I had to update a few of my older posts the last few days because over a period of 10 years or so, since I've been blogging and since I've been doing videos, it just so happened that because I try to stay up on world events and geopolitical events, not just in the moment, but in the long term. And this is what I would try to explain that maybe people don't understand the broader picture. The United States government, for many, many years, had a goal and still has the goal. And these are like people that are influential behind the scenes, military, things like that. And people give different names. And this is not a conspiracy video, by the way. But the position of the United States, people in influence, people in power, was really ultimately the isolation of Russia, the downfall of Russia, and what that leads to in history is ultimately the assassination or execution of Mr. Putin. Now listen closely. The goal of the US and then of the Western world for a long time was those things. Okay? It was the ultimate isolation of Russia. Then the different countries around the former Soviet Union, around Russia, those becoming allies. They all have good intents to do that, by the way, Ukraine or any of the others. But then the end result would have been, in the long term, over many years, that Russia would collapse and, Mr. Putin would face execution and war crimes. Now, if I gave you the history, I have a lot of world maps. That's played out in different places over these last 15 years or so. Meaning, we get caught up in news cycles and we understand, oh, there was a war, regardless of where, there's an invasion. I can show you one in Libya, which is North Africa, and a man by the name of Mr. Gaddafi, who had an alliance, somewhat agreement with the US that Libya will never seek nuclear weapons, came out publicly on that. And the way our politics work in our country, we elected Mr. Obama, and for certain things that happened at that time, the shores of Tripoli, off of Libya, we pretty much went in and backed the execution of Mr. Gaddafi in so many ways, okay? Now, these were all political reasons. I'm not saying, I'm just giving a little history. And then we did the same thing in Iraq, which was the various reasons, people behind the scenes. It was a retaliation of 9/11 attacks. I have the World Trade Tower right here, pictures of it. I grew up right there, that part of our country. And so we made decisions that were based on various things that were not true. How many Mr. Bush, I think, was convinced people like Mr. Rumsfeld, these were all generals, leaders in our US government, they had an idea that, well, if we take down Iraq and replace it with people that are kind of allied somewhat with the United States, it would change things in that part of the world. Now, these were old people in the US government and elected as well as unelected people that have ideas about the way the world should have been shaped. After World War II, you could say the map was redrawn, and there were debates between the different winners. Russia was actually on the United States side in World War II, and a lot of people believe that the tragedy of the bombs that the U.S., the only country in history to have used nuclear weapons, hydrogen nuclear, to wipe out civilian cities. The only country in the history of the world to have done that is the United States of America, which those who know the history of World War II. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki were annihilated by the United States, Western world. But at the time, the military in Japan that was fighting, we entered the war because of the attack of Pearl Harbor, and they still didn't want to give up, meaning their understanding of the bombs that Mr. Truman, Harry Truman, dropped on Japan that annihilated those two cities. The military people that were still fighting, there was a lot going on in World War II, not just as simple as people would learn the history book of it. But they felt like they should keep fighting because they didn't understand nuclear. They just thought, well, these are bombs. And obviously they were powerful bombs. But then what happened was Russia decided to turn their enormous troops that way and to begin a massive alliance of a ground campaign going towards Japan. That was a big factor in the surrender of Japan, okay? The bombs obviously played a role, but it was the Russian troops that were finally, under Mr. Joseph Stalin, that were decided to go that way. Here's a war map. Okay, so that ending of the war, there was a reshaping of the way Europe would be and the reshaping of the world. And people all had good ideas, or people had debating ideas. Russia, Mr. Stalin felt like he didn't get his due, if you will, at the table. And you had Winston Churchill and our U.S. president, of course, the initial one, Roosevelt, died, but Truman. And so there was a dividing line of how do we redraw the map of Europe and so forth after World War II. And things happen, you know, colonizations of parts of Africa, things that might not have been or were not good. But either way, we had the position in the overall U.S. behind the scenes that Russia was an enemy. And it was really our goal, really not to ever have a normal relationship with that country, no matter what. Eventually, we would hopefully get these other countries, the former Soviet Union, to join NATO. And then ultimately, for Russia to be the enemy, and for us to continue particular, we had many sanctions on them already, besides one this last week. Now, because a lot of people, well-meaning people who watch news and things, they're caught up in the moments of things. And so the official position of Russia for many years in their military school and things of that nature has been, this is what will eventually take place, that the U.S. and the Western world will never really change their underlying political motive to bring Russia down. And that's reality. Now, over these years where Mr. Putin has been in charge, you had Medvedev, you know, elected at one time, but Mr. Putin behind the scenes. They did make attempts through various things to have alliances that were just simply normal alliances. Their energy going to Germany, this pipeline is just now, the Nord Stream has just been shut down, obviously. But their position, Mr. Putin's position in Russia was simply, look, I do want to just have our country established, and it is not my goal, that's their position, to basically take over. Now, I understand there's U.S. intelligence people that say Russia's and Putin's view is to reestablish the former Soviet states. And yes, he felt like after the fall of the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev and Reagan years, he felt like that was also like a loss of certain things. So Ukraine and Russia have a history as well as these other places. But if the U.S. position is what I just stated, and there was no real intent to change that position, then you had, this is the role that the media and politics in our country was so damaging to this point. Then you had all types of media and politics that, for various reasons, had a total demonization of Russia, and they did not distinguish at times between Russia and the Russian people, which was a mistake. It was a mistake that was also made in World War II, because if you could demonize the Japanese people, there was a lot of video or pictures and all of the Japanese people. They referred to them as Japs, in public, which is derogatory. They had them look like, insects or roaches or things, sadly. And so there was a demonization over these last 4 years, 5 years, had to do with U.S. politics that had non-stop Russian bad, Russian evil, Russian wicked. And some of those particular lines had to do with the current sitting president in a political forums to accuse falsely of misdeeds of your own son in a political campaign, and to say the Russians did this or the Russians did that. And you have video online of Mr. Hunter Biden saying, oh, the Russians got a hold of one of the laptops. Now, this was in a national forum where behind the scenes, they could overlook that. This is not because of that. But when that trend of hate them, any alliance that the U.S. would make a deal with Russia, whether it was under Mr. Trump or whoever, would be deemed the Russians got something on you. The non-stop media, 5 years, whatever it was, hate them, lying in many cases. And it didn't help that the media was so, biased in so many of these things. So in the mind of Mr. Putin, not just this year, but over this long period of years, understanding that the ultimate goal of the Western world was to not really ever work with them. And that's where you would hear Mr. Trump at times say, what's wrong with trying to work with the Russian people? And immediately, the media, they have blackmail on them, they have this, they have that. And I had believed for a long period of time, there's going to come a day where the countries, not just Russia, but others, are going to get fed up and say, we've seen the writing on the wall. People took lightly when there were protests in Russia and in Moscow years back. And so you had different countries that used to protest. It's happened in Libya and different places. And then the Western world, the leader of the West, whoever the president is, or someone like Hillary Clinton or others. I remember Hillary Clinton made a statement like, maybe it's time for Putin to go. Now, when the Western world makes those statements, or they're killing their own people, sort of like when the U.S. killed a bunch of children this last year in 2 strikes, which I covered, that was totally overlooked. We killed an aid worker and his family in an Afghanistan strike, accidentally, but we tried to cover that up. Then we killed, again, a bunch of kids and a family in Syria, which nobody's covered. Meaning, we seem to say, this is when you see manipulation, which is not good. But when you hear he killed his own people, there's this image like killing of other people is acceptable. See, the killing of anybody is not acceptable. But in the long run, when these few things, hopefully, I helped with seeing the broader picture, in the long run, I felt like Mr. Putin, and as well as other nations, but the ones that had the ability, meaning they have the nukes, that they would finally say, we've had enough, meaning a long-term thing. I felt like for a long time, I had one of the posts called World War III in Russia. I might have changed the title of that at one point, but this was 5-6 years ago. And I said, I believe if we don't change our view of what I just explained on this, that we're going to push them to the brink of World War III. Without trying to be an alarmist at all, we really much are there now because of the way world sanctions are taking place and things are happening. We're pretty much there at this point. And most of you should realize that Mr. Putin has directly said that to the U.S. That if you try in any way militarily to involve yourself, you'll see devastation in your country like you have never seen before. There was a couple of maps I saw the last few days of the key cities that are targeted. The U.S. understands that if a nuclear war broke out, that there are certain key cities targeted, key population centers. There was a few in Texas, by the way. And as much as I love New York City, I always understood that that would also be a key target because it's a media and a financial center of the world. Now, I wouldn't speak like this, except I feel like it's important that we see the whole background. It was very unhelpful that the United States and the United States media actually did a lot of things, a lot of slander against Russia. This is not a defense of what's happening in any way. I'm trying to say I felt like it was going to push him and the country, the leadership, to the edge of where they're at. Now, it's important when I'm trying to be an honest broker in appealing to people. But it is important that there were some things that I felt were possibly in Mr. Zelensky. I respect him, but there might have been some problems with his goal is to get the United States and the world to go in and help militarily. And sometimes when you're in a bind, many countries have done this in the history of war. You allow certain bad things to happen to your civilians, or you might have something for the media to see. And so when I initially saw the media show like a tank crushing a vehicle, I didn't think Russia would. It didn't seem like that they would have done that. And then they showed that on the media quickly when it happened. This was in Ukraine this past week. And so there was a question about whether that's actually was a Russian tank, meaning there might be some propaganda that Mr. Zelensky would like the world to see that they're in a very bad spot. And so sometimes you allow, so there were some reports that some people were being used as human shields. I read some of them. So now I don't want to give rise to anything that's online right now. I see a lot online and I'm not looking for it. It's just I'm doing my sites. And I do 120 something sites. So some are right leaning, some are left leaning. So I'll see one thing or I'll see another. But just I'm giving you what I saw in the news. And I do read mainstream and look at mainstream as well as all sides, NBC, ABC, CBS, as well as the others. So it made me wonder that there might be some of that going on in Ukraine. There might be some civilians being allowed to be killed or some of that. So what we say is we want every side to act justly. I find it interesting that we rightfully say that civilians should never be targeted in war. And then we look at certain things, well, this could be a war crime. And I always felt like the taking of life and the going to war itself is a war crime. The taking of life and going to war itself is a war crime. And Isaiah talks about peace. There should be war no more. Now, the reason I wanted to give that little background that I did, I wanted you to see that if a leader of any country truly believes that the United States or the Western world ultimately wants the downfall of that country and the execution of that president, if they know that, because that's the underlying current that's taking place, that has taken place in our country for many years. And then if you had, whether it was Trump or anyone else, who said, why can't we make some regular, normal relationships with that country? And then our media was immediately, no. Now they read this, not just the politic part, they read the underlying current of our system. And what they see is the writing on the wall, which is we're going to continue to build alliances right around Russia and ultimately bring them down. And there are many astute military, political, geopolitical analysts online and everywhere that say yes. Meaning if you asked them today and said, is your ultimate goal the downfall of Russia itself and the execution of Mr. Putin? And their answer would have been, yes, that's our goal. Now, they knew that, and they waited for a while. You know, this is over a period of 10, 15-year period we're talking about. And they thought, will the trend ever change? Meaning, will the United States or trend ever change where they would just view Russia or Eastern Europe as we're going to live as a people, and you in the West are going to have that trend is not changing. Meaning, if I were to tell you today, sincerely, if none of this happened right now, our goal and trend from the United States government was to ultimately bring down the country. And if he got killed and we executed him and everybody else in leadership, that was the U.S. goal behind the scenes. Now, why is it important for you to see that? Because the people that, if you will run the country, they need to be more accountable. There should never be people behind the scenes, whether it's Donald Rumsfeld or I could give you so many names, that are behind the scenes, have sincere agendas, and we can call neocons and then they persuade leaders, whether it's Mr. Bush, Mr. Obama, Mr. Biden, or Mr. Trump, and then they have these ideas of the world, and then we move forward. So what I said for many years, not just today, is if the U.S. didn't change that view, you're going to have World War III. That was the reality on the ground. And I said more than one time this over a period of 10 years now. I said, ultimately, this will lead someday to World War III and on the verge of a nuclear war. Now, in all honesty, we are there today. We're there today. The immediate thing that we're seeing is Russia-Ukraine, which we want peace. We don't want war. But to see what I tried to just show, that if you have a U.S. leader, and it happened to be Miss Hillary Clinton at the time, and when there was an uprising in Moscow and in Russia years ago, the immediate statements from Miss Clinton, but others were, well, maybe it's time for him to go. And when we in the West use that statement publicly, what that means is Gaddafi, you're going to get executed in Libya. Saddam, you're going to get executed in Iraq. See, that's a history. So when our political leaders make those statements, it gives them a note. They're put on notice that if we ever have another problem or uprising, the West will back up our execution, which we have done. So we should have had a different way that we viewed the world, not to demonize any particular person or country. And so, yes, Mr. Putin certainly put out word during this conflict that if you get involved now, U.S. militarily, you will see devastation. He said that. You will see devastation like you have never seen. And I saw those targets of the major cities. And there was a bunch of major cities. There were 3 in Texas, but this is an actual target list that is available, that geopolitical people look at over time, and it was just posted. It wasn't to say that he was going to do it, but it was to say that these were the centers that we always felt if nuclear war broke out, these were the ones that would be hit. Now, I'll end it with this to say, this is not a defense of this invasion in any way, shape, or form. But this is to show us, I'm 59, is to show people in the younger generation who are caught up in a lot of things and they don't maybe see, some do, but maybe they don't. So that's why I simply felt like the position that the U.S. had for all these years should have not been decided by people behind the scenes to have that. If we believe in democracy, if you elect a president, that doesn't mean that the generals behind the scenes, the politicians behind the scenes, the influential people could continue to decide their role in things. And then when you had a president, whether it's Trump or anybody, when you had a president that said, well, why don't we just work with them? And then you had an outrage, a media outrage, to work with the killer that has no soul. You see, we're going to reap it. That we publicly made millions of statements that Mr. Putin has no soul, they're killers, they're murderers, on and on and on and on and on and on. Russia did this, Russia did this. That's not why this is happening, but that showed this man the reality on the ground, that in that atmosphere, the underlying view of let's eventually see the downfall of Russia, that was never going to change in this atmosphere. So what he felt for many years was the survival of Russia was not going to, unless they did something, they felt for many years, unless they had to push back the Western European influence. And they felt it was encroaching on getting these other countries into NATO and so forth. They felt this trend would never change. And Mr. Putin felt like if you had weapons in Ukraine, US, NATO, and so forth, and then you have another media storm of Russia's the enemy, and then if you had an uprising in the streets and Putin, which he declared today martial law, and then you had all these bases around Russia, well, it would be so easy for us to go in and back up his assassination like we did in other places. He saw that. He saw that. And so it's no purpose today to go back and forth. I mean, the immediate thing is a tragedy. But it's good to understand what I tried to hopefully explain in this 30-minute talk. All sides, we want peace. But what led to this? And what led to this was a long trending 10, 15-year view of the West that it was, hopefully I explained to you. The ultimate view of the West was the downfall of Russia, regardless of any other thing. Now, maybe we didn't state that publicly over a period of years, but that was the behind-the-scenes view. And it certainly didn't help for U.S. politicians and U.S. media to go on a 5-year tirade of the man has no soul, he's a killer, he's a murderer, on and on and on. That would give a political cover to back the ouster of Putin before any of this happened. That would be the trend in the psyche of the Western world, that it's time for him to go. And when those statements were made, he saw the writing on the wall. So what would have the solution have been? We should have simply said that we'll work with any country, have alliances and so forth. We still are receiving their energy sources. And it's kind of disgraceful that the U.S. government has said, Mr. Biden and Ms. Kamala Harris said, nothing's off the table. Look, the number one sanction that would have affected that country would have been to stop the shipment, to not receive it. So I don't want to get into the U.S. politics side of it. I wanted you to see the broader picture. And hopefully, if you see it, there's a lot more that's at play. But if you saw it, that's why I spoke over 10 years. And I used to use the term World War III. It might still be on some of them, because of the reality, as I had said for a long time, people would ask me, do you think we'll see it? I said, we'll see it in our lifetime. But, and please understand, because of the way now the sanctions are going and countries are already aligning up, because of that, you pretty much have that. It's not broken out, but you had Mr. Putin not, there was no bluff when he told the U.S., you'll see a devastation like you have, meaning he felt like, I'm not justifying him, I'm not justifying anything, but he felt like the ultimate solution to him was, we're going to have to eventually do this. And so even if these concerns were brought up over a period of years between diplomats and all, and maybe behind the scenes, Russian diplomats who had contact with U.S. diplomats, maybe they would say things like, look, your country needs to maybe change your view. And then you had this firestorm of madness, of Russia, 5, 6 years in a row. Mr. Biden on a national stage slandering them. It's them that did it. It's not my son. Do you not think eventually, not that he would do this because of that, but he read the writing on the wall in the sense the environment of the country, because of media and politics, will never permit a normal relation with Russia. He saw that. So a 6-year campaign of that did not help, because what he needed in his understanding of being Russia was to have an environment where he could have just worked without these other countries joining NATO. But when the environment turned to the point of calling for his, we had American leaders basically call for his assassination. Because when you say the term, maybe it's time for him to go, which Ms. Clinton said, what that means is we'll back the uprising and you will be executed and your family, because it meant that in other places. So this is nothing. This is just, we hopefully will see the responsibility that the Western world has in both media and public statements and things. And I just wanted to share that with you, that there is some, manipulation. Well, there's always manipulation in our media, but there's a lot online. There are things I saw that said Russia was going to publicly execute people. Then I saw one where Ukraine was going to publicly. So I'm seeing the same, unverified reports on both things. So please, everyone that is following these things, just try to avoid, whatever you're seeing, because we don't know yet about a lot of that. But this was why. This maybe gave you, because when the Western world said he's insane, he's crazy, he's a killer, he's got no soul, and then this was proof to them. See, we told you. But look, he's not stupid. He's watched the way things were trending, and he said, what is going to be the future of Russia? We're the enemy. The U.S. media constantly, without stop, I'm a murderer, I'm a killer, I'm a man without a soul, I hate children. No, every single day will never stop. I don't want to make a joke. I used to think, though, that even, I was going to say, I never said it, but I used to think, even if you had the country attacked in a nuclear war, I said, I still don't think the media would ever stop the constant manipulation of everything. And sadly, I'm still seeing and believing that now. They could have explained this to you. And if somebody tried to, in a public forum, whoever it was, then the other political side said, oh, let's go. They got dirt on him. They got dirt on this figure that's trying to say, let's stop with the Russia stuff. Let's stop with the Russia bashing, constant 5 years. And even if somebody tried to rise as a president and said, let's work with them, you would be demonized to the point they'd go after your family, your kid. You're going to go into court in New York and everything. So you created a big part of this. The media created a big part of the environment that showed Mr. Putin, but they're never going to work with us, and they're never going to stop trying to get these other countries into their. He sees NATO as a threat and as a military force, the U.S. and the other countries in NATO. And then when the U.S. began saying, we'll let Turkey into NATO, we'll let this one in, then it became to Mr. Putin, this isn't just a North Atlantic Treaty Organization anymore, which was created after World War II. He began seeing NATO as a Western U.S. alliance in force and military that was encroaching, if you will, upon the world. Now, he would never join it, but if you got along with him in some manner and showed you could have a relationship with Russia and other countries that were not going to be in NATO, but you didn't show that. You showed, let's get them 5 years straight. So the media plays a big role in the psyche of this thing. So I'll try to post it. I'm going to have to leave a lot of these platforms. I'll just, because everything with Google is, Google went after some Christian ones, shut everything down, his Gmail, his email, his YouTube, everything in one day. I have one of his books here. I won't even mention his name. So I can't, it's sad because I'm on Blogger and all. So you'll see this on YouTube, but I'm going to have to leave all those platforms. I have the others. So I just have to dissociate from that because it's just, I can't do anything I'm supposed to do. So I'll just, when I close those, I'll just leave them up, but I'm going to have to just leave that. Okay, Father, I do pray that this would not be seen in any way as a defense of the invasion of Russia and Ukraine. I pray that people would see the bigger picture, the bigger role and the bigger responsibility that the Western world had in this. Because we're now at the place where we're right there. We're right there. So I pray for peace. I pray blessing in everybody. And I pray we would understand things. That we'd be wise. We'd have wisdom. I ask in Jesus' name, amen. Oh, I got to swipe it every time now. God bless you all.